Lucy.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm very excited about this program. It's the first in a series of 5 programs that are part of our partnership this year with the Jewish Book Council, and which allow us to bring in and get to know several authors who have written books and are being and are associated with the Jewish Book Council, and that's a really wonderful partnership for our community, and I hope that we are able to continue to have that partnership. Tonight's program is in some ways a program about honoring fathers. It's appropriate because our author tonight, through a labor of love, honored her own father by taking his memoir and making it into a book. And when I saw this book being offered as one of the options for our partnership with the Jewish Book Council, I immediately thought of Debbie Yablon and Sandy. Sandy is Debbie's sister, and I thought about their father, Heinz Happ, who's a longtime member of our congregation, and whose story has some overlap, some similarities with the story of Jean Hoffman Lewanda's father, that is the subject of her book. And when I thought about that connection, I thought we have to get Miss Lewanda here to share her story, and I'd really love it for Debbie to be able to introduce and also share some of her own father's story, and so that we can together honor the memories of both of these individuals, for whose stories are not the same, but whose overlapping narratives are similar enough that they immediately came present into my. I hope you'll also be able to see some of the similarities. So I'm going to invite Debbie to introduce our author for this evening, and I'd just like to say on behalf of the Adult Education Committee how grateful we are, and express my gratitude both to the Happ Yablon families and Klein family, and also especially to our author, who is making time to come and to share of her journey and her father's story with us this evening. You should make sure to save the date for the next one of our programs, which is in mid-December, and I believe Ambassador Martin Indyk will be coming to share about his story at that program. So without further ado, Debbie Yablon.
Thank you, Rabbi. First of all, let me say thank you, Rabbi, for being so very thoughtful and kind in thinking about my sister and myself, and my father, of course, in bringing Jean here, because you're right that there's a lot of overlap between what my father experienced and I think what Jean's father experienced. There are some differences. Yeah, my father was quite a bit younger, I believe, than Jean's father. So the experiences that they had, of course, would be very different. You know, my father was 10 or 11 when he got to Shanghai, and I believe, Jean, that your father was closer to 19.
He was 18 years old, but we're going to see a lot of experience with my uncle, who came from.
Yeah.
I've included some slides about my uncle, whose story, although my uncle was 18 years older than your dad, there is a lot of overlap there.
Yeah, I'm sure there was. My dad was born in 1928, so and he was there during Kristallnacht. He was 10 years old and didn't understand what was happening, other than shops were being broken and glass was shattered and Jewish homes were being looted, and businesses. And he looked around and asked a nearby man standing near him, "What's going on?" And the man said, "Oh, we're getting the Jews out. You know, we don't want them here in Berlin anymore, and they have no place here in Germany." At which point my father realized, you know, it's not going to be safe being in Germany throughout the war. And his parents luckily agreed and made the decision to go to Shanghai within a year, within actually 6 months of Kristallnacht. And he was actually in Shanghai, China from 1939 to 1947. So he had quite a number of years there as a young child and became a young man and left Shanghai when he was about 18, 19 years old himself. So I think in terms of the overlap, you know, that they both experienced some adulthood there. My father always related Shanghai to us as almost as if, and Sandy can back me up on this, my sister's on as well, that it was almost like a camp, and I mean like a summer camp. He was there with all his friends. They were living in a big place. He was an only child, my father. So he enjoyed being with all the other young people and being all together. And, you know, the community got together and made a whole society in terms of teachers and artists and doctors and medical professionals and all the people who had been educated in Vienna and Austria as well as in Germany, pooled their resources and used a lot of their own gifts, talents, and education to make life a little bit more bearable in Shanghai. But despite that, it was a ghetto, and it was pretty bad. It sounded like my father would talk about squeezing life out of his hair and out of his friend's hair, and they would make a game of it. They had all kinds of diseases, typhoid, and he saw a lot of suicides of people who became very depressed there. So I know those were our experiences that he shared with us. And I'm very interested in hearing from you, Jean, what your father's experiences were and how they may relate or may be different.
Okay. So I'd like to share the screen first so that, let's see if we can get that going right away. So before I get started. Okay, let's get into present mode. Okay, looks like we're ready to fly. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you very much for allowing me to speak to you about my father's family experience, escaping the Holocaust, and to introduce you to the Jewish community that survived World War II in Shanghai, China. I've had the great good fortune that my dad left a very detailed memoir, as well as documents, photos, and artifacts that I have been able to compile into the book you see here on screen, Witness to History from Vienna to Shanghai. And this is my bio. I am the firstborn American in my family. I was born just shy of a few weeks of my parents' first anniversary in this country. So after the Anschluss on March 12th, 1938, it became evident to most of my educated and well on the road to being assimilated family that despite their allegiance and love of the Austrian Republic, that Vienna was no longer their home. All of the younger generation were at least in their teens, and all efforts were made to find safe haven for the children first. My grandparents stood at the train station saying goodbye to both their children within 2 days of each other. And as you know, countries around the world were not forthcoming with visas, and the Nazis required proof of destination and transport. The UK was allowing young women to enter as maids and nannies. So my 20-year-old aunt was sent to London. For my father, second-class passage to Shanghai, China was purchased on the Conte Verde, a small luxury liner in the Lloyd Trestino line that regularly made trips to the east, mostly carrying businessmen and a few tourists. Shanghai was an open port with an international settlement controlled by a number of different countries. No entry visas were required. So at 18 years of age, on October 30th, 1938, my dad boarded a train to Trieste, here in Italy, and then was on his way for a 1-month journey to some of the world's most exotic ports of call, having never been more than 150 miles away from home, mostly in the mountains in Hungary for summer vacations. This slide shows the route, which at first seemed like an exciting adventure, until the reports of Kristallnacht reached the ship 10 days into his journey. Fortunately, a telegram was waiting for him when he arrived in Singapore that my grandparents were safe due to the efforts of some righteous Gentiles. Dad arrived in Shanghai on November 28th, 1938. Although on a large map of the world, Shanghai appears to be on the east coast of China, it is actually 30 miles inland on the Huangpu River, land that had been developed over the years, swampy land. This simplified map shows you the international settlement. That's where the British, the Americans, and the French concession, and the area known as Hangqiu, which came to play a very important role in the lives of the refugees from Central Europe. But this is what actually greeted the refugees when they arrived. Oops, go. This is the area called the Bund, if any of you have had the privilege of traveling to China. This is still the view of the Bund. Bund is a Persian word meaning embankment, a wide open thoroughfare with banks, consulates, businesses, and wharves built by the British, Americans, French, and other foreign nationals that came to Shanghai after the Opium Wars of the 1840s. On the other side of the Huangpu, over here, they've seen pictures of some beautiful modern high rises, the Pearl Building, a couple of the tallest buildings in the world. Along the riverbank, there were go-downs or warehouses for all the goods that were entering and exiting China. And these were the wharves of the different nationalities these were the consulate buildings. But here's an actual street map of Shanghai in the 30s and 40s. As you can see, there are a lot of streets. It was extremely densely populated. It was a bustling modern city. It was called the Paris of the East. There were electric trolleys, streetlights, rickshaws, cars, movie theaters, nightclubs, department stores, all levels of housing, a race course, social clubs, very much a colonial outpost for foreigners who had come to Shanghai for economic reasons and sometimes to hide out too. It was a place where people came when they had needed to be somewhere else. Oops, why are we going in the wrong direction here? I can't go on right now any further without mentioning this individual, Dr. Ho Fengshan. He was a Chinese diplomat stationed in Vienna in the late 1930s. He had befriended many Jews and he wanted to support them. He was given explicit orders by the Consular General in Berlin not to issue travel documents. And again, no travel documents were necessary to enter Shanghai, but Dr. Ho went ahead and issued, I've heard as many as 1,800. He clearly saved thousands of lives. My dad, as far as I know, had no knowledge of Dr. Ho, and that could have been because he was among the very first to leave. But my grandparents received their deportation orders to Poland in October of 1939. And maybe he signed their papers because they were given a 2-month extension. It was given enough time for my father to arrange for their transport to China. And Dr. Ho was recalled to China, I believe in 1940s, and suffered the consequences of his action. He died in San Francisco in the late 1990s, and on his deathbed, he shared with his daughter, a journalist, what he had done. I'm not sure why these slides are not traveling in the right direction. Well, so there are several good reasons for the Jewish refugees to have come to Shanghai, including the fact that there was a Jewish community there to welcome them. Iraqi Jews, most notably the Sassoons and the Kaduris, and maybe some of you have read the book, The Last Kings of Shanghai, who had fled to India after being expelled from Iraq, had made a vast fortune in the opium trade and had become some of the wealthiest people in Shanghai as real estate barons and owners of utilities, as well as many other ventures. Their wealth also extended to charitable causes. This building here, one of the floors, this was a Sassoon building, was devoted to a reception center for refugees. Trucks and buses were sent down to the wharves to meet the boats that carried the refugees. And then they were brought back into town where they were given instructions. They were provided with housing, food, money, and help getting started by this Sephardi community. This picture here, oh my goodness, let's go, is the Shanghai Jewish School. This school was founded by the Kaduris. When I visited Shanghai in 2019, I saw this photograph in the Shanghai Jewish Refugee Museum, and lo and behold, this is my uncle, my mother's brother. 1943, he was 12 years old and part of this class at the Shanghai Jewish School. This building is the Ohel Rachel Synagogue. The Ohel Rachel was built, I believe, by David Sassoon in memory of his wife. This synagogue is being used sporadically by the Chabad in Shanghai. The Chinese communists have a fear of religious gatherings. They allow the Chabad to enter for a few hours at a time for special occasions. We were there the week before Rosh Hashanah, and they were cleaning the synagogue so that it could be used for services the coming week. This is acting finicky here. Okay, this is the street corner in Hangzhou. This photo was taken in 1939 by my uncle. Now, most of the refugees arrived with little or no money. Despite the generosity of the Sephardi community, the only available housing was in the poor Chinese section of the city that was adjacent to the international settlement. You can see that it was a busy street corner in 1939. This is how it looks today. Hasn't changed. The lanes or loos, narrow streets. There was no indoor plumbing in the late 30s, early 40s in Hangzhou. And to this day, residents are emptying their slop pots in this building. Back in the late 30s and 40s, there was a Chinese coolie, they called it, who came with the honey cart, and you would bring your chamber pot down in the morning to be dumped. I understand that waste was used for fertilizer in the countryside. Today, the only modernization might be window air conditions. Plumbing is a sink in the front foyer of some of these apartments. Now, some were more fortunate than others, and in that they found a way not to live in Hangzhou. This is an apartment building in the French Concession. This actually is the apartment building where my mother's family lived. My mother was a Russian Jew, who was a family that had come to China fleeing the pogroms, the Russian Revolution, and the civil wars early in the 1900s. My mother was born in Harbin in the north. Her family migrated to Shanghai in 1940. And this is the apartment where she lived until she married my dad in 1950. This is stands for the Asian Realty Company. It was an American-owned company. I understand that these apartments are quite spacious, and this is a picture someone sent me in the last few weeks of the actual apartment building. Now, although the community of Russian Jews was also stateless, holding no documentation from any country, they lived in China in relative peace and prosperity for close to 50 years until the communist takeover in May 1949. And another advantage of living in China was there was no anti-Semitism. The Chinese basically did not know much about who the Jewish people were, and the two communities lived and worked together, satisfying each other's needs in many ways, and developed a great love and mutual respect for each other. And the Chinese government has made an effort now to try to preserve buildings that were synagogues and schools in both Harbin and in Shanghai. Now, here's another review of the French Concession. The French Concession to this day is one of the loveliest neighborhoods in Shanghai. These trees here are huge shade trees now. These apartment buildings, stores, Art Deco, beautiful private homes also. The streets of private homes for affluent people. And for most of my dad's 13 years in Shanghai, he was able to find some kind of housing in the French Concession. Well, how did Dad sustain himself? He was 18 years old. He was here by himself. He first started tutoring the children of other foreign nationals, Dutch, German. He was fluent in French and in German. He found English fairly easy to learn, became pretty fluent pretty quickly. He sold advertising for an American language radio station, XMHA, the Voice of the Orient. This radio station was notorious for its anti-Japanese rhetoric. The Japanese had been in Shanghai since 1937, and after Pearl Harbor, the radio station had to shut down because of the events that were associated with that, and I'll talk some more about that as we go forward. The refugees from Germany, Austria, and Poland quickly normalized their lives in Shanghai as best they could, although it was at first abhorrent to think of a human being as a beast of burden. The rickshaw puller or rickshaw coolie, this was his means of livelihood, and the Europeans soon learned that you did the Chinese rickshaw puller no favor by refusing a ride. More than likely you were charged double, but it was finally accepted. My father at one point had a private rickshaw that he shared with a friend. Rickshaw came, picked him up, took him to work. Rickshaw went back to his friend's house, was at the woman's beck and call as she needed, and the driver could then go out and get other fares while he was not serving the people that he had signed up to take care of. So this is another example of how life normalized. This is in the Hankyu ghetto, what became known as Little Vienna. There were restaurants, there were coffee houses, there was music, there was entertainment. Even in the horrible heat and humidity of the Shanghai summer, people gathered and enjoyed each other's company as best they could. So another bit of normalization. This my father's sister came in 1940. My father had sent a ticket to her saying, leave London, war is breaking out in Europe, it's safer in Shanghai. She was on a French boat. She was immediately placed in the hold with other Jews, mostly, because they were enemy nationals, because they were Austrian. And my father had no idea where his sister was for an entire month. The French line would not communicate. He came down to the pier, and there was his sister. Came off the boat, said, I'm hungry. On that same day, my uncle was there to meet the son of a friend, and saw my aunt for the first time, he said. And my uncle was in Dachau, so this is more like Debbie's father's story. He was quite a bit older than her dad. He was 28 years old, and he had left Berlin. He was working in Bavaria, and he was one of the 30,000 males that were rounded up on Kristallnacht, served 2 months in Dachau. It was early enough in the war that you could buy your freedom. His father came, bought him out. The condition was you would leave Germany right away. For 2 weeks, every morning, he reported to the Gestapo office, Karl-Heinz Israel Prager. And then after 2 weeks, he was on a boat to Shanghai, where he earned his living as a photographer. Well, and these are my grandparents, who, as I said, arrived in January 1940 from Vienna. So the Japanese had a strong presence in China starting in 1931, 1932. They took control starting in the north and worked their way down until they arrived in Shanghai in 1937, leaving portions of the city after a major battle destroyed. They actually had their headquarters in the Hangzhou area. In 1941, the Japanese decided that all Jewish refugees arriving in Shanghai after 1937 had to move into a 1 square mile area that became known as the Hangzhou Ghetto. This was a huge blow to the Jewish community. Those who had lived in relative comfort outside of Hangzhou were forced to seek housing in crowded, deplorable conditions, which many of the refugees who did not come with money had been experiencing since their arrival. Not only was there no plumbing, there was no cooking facilities. Stoves were makeshift hibachis. Sometimes a clay flower pot with heated charcoal was the only thing they had to cook on. My father was able to file extensions for himself and his parents until 1943. Because my grandfather was a doctor, my father was a student. The Japanese did have respect for educated people. But by 1943, they too were then forced to move into a single room, 12 by 15 room for the three of them. Then Dad found a room for himself, just big enough for a bed and a table, no electricity, and the outhouse was on the roof right outside his window. My grandparents' apartment, it was 4 stories down to the outhouses, and as Debbie mentioned, sanitation was deplorable. Everyone received vaccinations, fortunately, because there was a Jewish hospital, but typhoid, malaria, food-borne diseases, typhus was rampant. My family lived under these conditions until the end of the war in 1945. An additional burden imposed by the Japanese was that Hangzhou truly became a ghetto. There was a 7 p.m. curfew and no one left without an official pass. This is my uncle's pass. They were issued usually for a period of 2 months. Again, students were able to get passes. He has worked as a photographer outside of the ghetto confines. In addition to having to use a pass, just like the Nazis, the Japanese imposed duties on the leaders of the Jewish community and members of the Jewish community, like guard duty. My dad had to stand guard overnight. It was not unusual to see corpses lying on trash heaps because the poor Chinese could not afford to bury their dead. The head of the ghetto was a small, tyrannical Japanese man named Kano Goya. He called himself the king of the Jews. Sometimes he would stand on the table and tantrum. He would punch people, slap people. So he acted as a tyrant because he could, because he had been given this assignment. So I'd like to get back to talking about other Jews who were in Shanghai, and that was my mother's community of Russian Jews.
Jean,
Yes.
I just had to comment quickly. My father did talk about that small Japanese king of the Jews. Apparently, my father's father was a very tall man, at least by Asian standards. And he was very jealous of tall men, and he used to beat my grandfather. My grandfather avoided him because he would just beat him mercilessly. So he was a tyrant.
Yes. My grandfather did not leave the ghetto because he refused the humiliation of waiting online he had an office outside the ghetto for a little bit, and then he gave up his medical office, and for 2 years he did not leave the ghetto. My father stood in line so he could go to school and teach, and he supported the entire family through those 2 years because, as I said, my grandfather refused to stand online. So this is my mom at age 16. As I mentioned, there were many social clubs. There was American Club, British Club. There was a Shanghai Jewish Club that was very active. And this is Hanukkah, 1944. And even though the people who were outside of Hankyu had rations and blackouts, their lives did not change that much. They still socialized, they still went to work. My mom left school. The Shanghai Jewish Club eventually had to shut down. The Japanese appropriated the building, but my mom had to leave actually before it closed because she needed to help her family. Her father was a tailor. My grandmother was cooking lunch for people and serving lunches like an at-home restaurant, which this still exists in China today. We actually had lunch in a Chinese home. And but she needed to help out with the family. She left school. She had some extra training with clerical skills, became a great typist, and she got a job at the Shanghai Gas Company, which was a Kadoorie-owned company. And here's Mom in the midst of many, many, mostly Chinese men. And she held this job till 1952 when my parents were able to leave Shanghai. So during 1943 to actually 1945 and then into 46, Dad continued riding many, many miles a day on his bicycle so that he could teach at the American private school. Well, now the Americans were either interned or had been repatriated. He kept the American private school going, working with the parents of the students, offering lessons of small groups of students in their homes. And this was the faculty of the American private school, my dad over here. And then they were able in 1946 to graduate this group of students. This is the graduating class of 1946 of the American private school. In the meantime, at age 23, Dad decided he needed a university education. And this is Aurora University. It was founded by French Jesuits. It still stands today. It is now Fudong University. It's still a prominent law school. This is the graduating class of 1946. My dad is right here. And this gentleman right here, Joe Tukashinsky, became Joseph Tekoa, who later served as the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations. Here's some documentation of my dad's studies. Aurora, the courses were taught in French and in Chinese. Dad did all his studies in French. He had to take oral exams. This is one of his oral exam certificates. And here's his transcript listing all the courses that he took and the grades he received. His favorite and best course was something called finance mathematics, because he originally thought he wanted to be an actuary, found out that this coursework wasn't going to do that for him. Well, his efforts paid off, because when the Americans came back, and many Americans and other foreign nationals came back, because it looked like China was going to go back to the way it was, very colonial city, prosperity, business. One of the teachers at the American school was a woman named Trey Copps. And when Dad graduated from Aurora, she told Dad to go see her husband, Paul Copps, and he was one of the senior partners at this prominent American law firm named Ullman, Copps and Lee. Norwood Ullman had come to China in 1916 as a student interpreter, supposedly met Mao, a young librarian in Beijing, then was assigned to outposts throughout China. 1925, he decided he hated the diplomatic corps, hated the pomp and circumstance, got involved with the law firm. It became his law firm. So this is the building in 2019. It's called Hamilton House. Again, a beautiful Art Deco building. The suite of offices where Ullman, Copps and Lee had its offices has been renovated, very modern, fluorescent lights. The hallways look like they looked 70 and 80 years ago. The varnish on the wood, the dark wood, is peeling. There are brass plates on the door. It was quite a trip back in time to visit Hamilton House. So after Dad met Mr. Copps, he said, come back the next day, you have a job. He was hired as a factotum. He performed all kinds of tasks as he learned to be a lawyer. 4 years later, he would be in charge of the entire law firm, closing it down as the senior American and Chinese partners were forced to leave as their lives were endangered due to the communist takeover in China. Another perk of this time period was he was invited back to Aurora to teach. And there's the course in finance mathematics and the course catalog from 48-49. And he is listed as the instructor of that course, originally taught by a Czech professor who went back to what was then Czechoslovakia. And in the interim, between 46 and 49, life resumed, as I said, in Shanghai. Dad was able to move back into the French concession. This is the entry to the apartment where he lived, and this is what he called his boy, his servant. He was being paid in American dollars. He was able to obtain an apartment for himself and his parents in the French concession. He also had a car with a chauffeur, and he would drive the car to work with the chauffeur next to him, send the car back home to his parents' apartment, so his parents had use of the car during the day while he was at work. He was encouraged to keep a horse. Polo was the popular sport, kind of like playing golf today, is business for business relationships and socialization. He never did become a polo player, but he did enjoy riding Felix in the countryside on the weekends. Now, all this wonderful, comfortable life was going to come to an end when on May 12th, 1949, the Chinese communist troops defeated the nationalists after many years of civil war. It became increasingly clear to all the foreigners who had found shelter in China for so many years that time was running out on safely departing as the communists began persecuting and confiscating the possessions of everyone, including well-to-do Chinese. Mom and Dad were witness to the beginnings of the reign of terror. My parents met in September of 1949 at a swim meet at the YMCA. My mom's family already had made plans to go to Israel. My mother's younger brother was already there serving in the IDF. My dad's family had already begun the migration to America. My father's sister, her husband, and young child. My cousin was born in Shanghai in the Jewish hospital, left on an American transport, naval transport, that brought them to San Francisco. My father's parents were there for my mother and father's wedding, but then spent 8 months. The Jewish Joint transported them back to Europe to displaced persons camp. And it was 8 months before they arrived in New York City. Dad's Austrian passport had been reinstated, so he would be able to travel legally. Mom had no viable identity papers or travel documents. On January 6, 1950, my parents were married in a civil ceremony at the law offices of Ullman, Copps, and Lee. The senior partner, known as Judge Ullman, for his role on the Shanghai Municipal Court, officiated. Dad then went to the Austrian embassy, which was soon to close, and obtained an Austrian passport for Mom. So this is my parents' Chinese civil wedding certificate, which all you had to do was agree to marry. You see their names in Chinese and their signatures. This is the signature of Judge Ullman, who officiated, and my 4 grandparents who witnessed the marriage document. Are we going in the... So on March 5th, 1950, my parents were actually married in a Jewish ceremony. In their wedding invitation says the Ohel Moshe Synagogue, but it says the address of Rue de Tenant de la Tour, which was in the French concession. The Ohel Moshe Synagogue was founded, the Russian Jewish community that came in the very early 1900s, built a synagogue on Ward Road in the Hankyu Ghetto. And this is now the Shanghai Jewish Refugees Museum. And for the last 5 years, I thought my parents were married there. I checked their wedding invitation and I saw the address of the synagogue in the French concession. There were 7 synagogues in Shanghai over that time period. This appears to be the new synagogue built in 1941. I have no idea at this moment. I'm checking my sources both in China and in other sources to find out why their invitation said Ohel Moshe Synagogue, but had the address of the synagogue, the new synagogue in the French concession. It seems that they may have actually gotten married in the French concession. The reception was also in the French concession at the American Masonic Club. But here is a picture of Mom and Dad leaving the synagogue. And this is my favorite picture because of the Chinese that were so excited, and this gentleman that was photobombing their wedding picture. And I shared this picture with the Shanghai Jewish Refugees Museum. There is a traveling exhibit, and I asked Jack earlier whether your community has seen it. There's now a panel for my parents and my aunt and uncle in the traveling exhibit. There's also the Shanghai Jewish Refugee Museum, where I was able to visit in 2019, is now, I understand, 4 times as large. They got extra space, and it's in the actual physical space of Little Vienna. And these are 2 of my parents' wedding gifts. Yes, I donated some silver. They had asked me to bring anything that I felt I could donate to the exhibit. So it looks beautiful, and hopefully one day we'll get back there to see more of what it looks like today. So on May 12th, 1949, when the Chinese Communist troops defeated the nationalists after many years of civil war, as I mentioned, the Americans had to repatriate, and my father's boss, Judge Ullman, approached him and asked him if he would be his proxy to settle the accounts of the firm, the many prominent American companies that they had been doing legal services for over the years. My father cut a deal that required him to stay. The Chinese communists were requiring that all businesses would be shut down and exit visas would not be issued until obligations were met to the Chinese employees. My dad elected to take this deal. He was being paid in American dollars. Half his money was being deposited in a bank in the States. The other half was being sent to Shanghai for them to live on. The other part of it was that they would have first-class passage to the United States when they were allowed to leave. After all matters were adequately settled. When the Judge Ullman and his wife repatriated, my parents moved into their very nice house on the outskirts of Shanghai for a few months. There were 5 servants. There were the dogs and the chickens, but this was of short duration because the communists appropriated the house and the possessions, and Mom and Dad had to move into a small apartment with friends. Not only did their living conditions change dramatically, but they were mostly housebound. They only left to go to work. There was people being dragged through the streets. There were suicides, Chinese people who, knew that they were going to be brought before these people's courts, humiliated in the stadiums. There were loudspeakers going constantly. And my father's life was in danger as well. He was being threatened by the Chinese workers. Several times on a Friday afternoon, they would lock him in the office and say, until you pay us, we're going to kill you. He had to set up a signal of phone calls with my mom. If she didn't hear from him at certain times, she knew to come with the police. The money that was necessary to shut down these businesses had been frozen by the United States Treasury as the Korean conflict had been escalating. Judge Ullman in the States was petitioning the Treasury Secretary, writing letters to congressmen. I have those letters in my possession saying, I left this young man in Shanghai as my proxy. He now has a young wife. He now has a pregnant young wife. I'm afraid for his life. So finally, in February of 1952, the funds came through the Treasury license that allowed Dad to settle the accounts of US Lines and other businesses finally came through. And Mom and Dad were allowed to leave Shanghai. They traveled 60 hours under constant surveillance to Canton. It doesn't take that long to get to Canton by train, but took 60 hours. They spent the night there. They had to report to the police in the morning again. It was another 3-hour train ride to Hong Kong, where once they crossed the bridge into Hong Kong, they were finally free. After a week or so in Hong Kong, they boarded a French ocean liner, the Felix Roussel, and spent the next month retracing the steps of that first map back to Europe. They landed in Marseille and then continued on to Vienna because there was family and some business there, where my brother was born in May of 1952. They were told that they would be given their visas soon, so they traveled to Italy, to a town named Nervi near Genoa, to wait for their documents. Unfortunately, my mother's last name was Frolov. Her father's name was Avram. When she was asked, where is your father? She said he had died in Israel in 1951, which was the case. But there was an Avram Frolov who was a communist union leader in San Francisco. And it was the McCarthy era. And they had to spend an additional 5 months in Italy until that situation had been cleared up. And in April 1953, they finally had a week's journey across the Atlantic to reunite with my father's family in New York. So I thank you so much for your attention today. I hope I've provided a glimpse into the Shanghai Jewish experience. There are so many fascinating stories, and I've only been able to touch on a few in today's presentation. I hope I've intrigued you sufficiently to pick up a copy of Witness to History from Vienna to Shanghai by Paul Hoffman, so you can experience the rest of my dad's incredible journey through some of the most important and world-changing events of the past century. I'd be happy to take any questions now. Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. What a story. I'm going to remove the spotlight so I can see if there's anybody who has any questions, and just feel free to unmute and ask.
Now, where were you born and where are you living now?
Well, right now I've retired to Yardley, Pennsylvania to be near my son and his family, but I was born in New York City. When my parents arrived in New York, my grandparents were in Utica, New York. If you were a doctor who was educated in Europe before World War I, all my grandfather had to do was take a GED, show that he was proficient in England, and he was given a position in a hospital in Utica, New York. So my grandparents were waiting at the boat, took my mother and brother up to Utica. My father traveled back and forth to New York and to find a job. And within a few months, they had an apartment in Flushing, and I was born in Kew Gardens Hospital. One of his strengths, or the business they did in Shanghai, was trademarks, and he became trademark counsel for General Electric. He worked in the field of trademarks. And we lived in Connecticut when GE moved its corporate headquarters. Well, first we lived in New York City. In 1974, GE moved its corporate headquarters to Fairfield, Connecticut. I actually went to State University of New York at Albany for my undergraduate work.
Me too.
and then NYU, and then my husband got a job in Connecticut, and that's where until 3 years ago, where I was.
Mm. More similarities. My aunt lived in Rome, New York, so we went from Schenectady to Rome. And, so
yes, it's a Jewish geography, small world.
Couple other small worlds. My husband is a patent attorney in Schenectady, and my father worked for GE for almost 40 years as a power systems engineer. He's actually world renowned in what he did. He essentially created the power grid that we're still using today.
Well, Dad came up to Schenectady many times, to visit the offices there during his career, and I was there, so it was a good excuse, come and visit.
My dad would have loved to have met your dad.
I'm sure.
He loved to meet other Shanghai Jews.
now, did your dad go to the many Shanghai reunions?
Yeah, my parents went to a couple of them. I have every bulletin from in Igudsin. My mother saved them. She had them in Russian and in English and some in Hebrew. I saved all the English language ones. I have them here. And I have met and spoken to many of her friends, Shanghailanders, and I have their memoirs here. And I'm now writing about my mom's experience, because it was very different than my dad's experience. They were never persecuted. They lived a very different life. In Harbin and Shenzhen, my mother belonged to Beitar, the Zionist movement. My grandfather was Zionist, and they were going to Israel. If my mother had not, and my father decided not to go to Israel because he could not speak Hebrew. He did not think his skill set would fit the new state. But my mother's family was there and, helped build the country.
What was your father's last name?
His name was Hoffman.
Say it again, please.
Hoffman.
Oh, Hoffman. Okay.
Yeah, Debbie and Sandy, I recall when Heinz went to the Shanghai reunions, I think there were some pictures that he came back with that, that looked like a class photo that had, at least 100 or more people in it. I'm wondering if we have those around somewhere.
And then, unfortunately, since COVID, I kept in touch with the organization, and I do know someone who was in touch directly with people in Tel Aviv. There's a synagogue in honor of this Chinese Jewish community. The community, it looks like the community finally got that old, and then with COVID, and that they may have shut down in 2021. There's been no communication since 2021 that I can track down. But if you go on their website, you good sin, you can track back through it. So there's some books that I'm still looking for that are out of print, but yes, if you haven't read Stateless in Shanghai by Lillian Willens, that's available on Amazon, and that's how my book got published. Lillian Willens was Russian Jewish parents who came to Shanghai immediately from Harbin, lived in the French concession, went to the French school, and she got stuck in Shanghai till 1951, her father until 52, and it's another fascinating story. And she took my father's manuscript to the publisher in Shanghai, and she said, I think there's another book here. And he agreed to publish it. And this has become something much bigger than me over the last couple of years, because my dad just left it for the family. And he's been gone since 2010. So.
We had another member of our congregation who was in Shanghai, Nadja Finkelstein. And I don't know what her maiden name was, but on a couple of occasions, she did speak about her time in Shanghai.
I think I know. I think she's a relative of, is her Ehrlich was her maiden name, I believe?
It's possible. Her husband.
Ehrlich.
Yes.
Her husband taught at Union College.
Yes. So I met Nadja maybe 10, 12 years ago. My father talked about going to a family who he had been given the name. It was a connection by marriage. The second, after his first night, he arrived. He was put in the Hankyu. The next day he went to visit the Asinovsky, and because that was the sister of the Ehrlichs, and Nadja was 7 years old, and her father actually met my father at the boat and said, come tomorrow. And I made a donation, and I wrote the letter explaining it, and I got a letter from her saying, I'm living in Andover, Massachusetts.
Yeah.
My husband and I went to visit her, and I have met her nephew, Elijah Wald, who has he's written and connected about that part of the family. So how about that? That's kind of cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, and now I remember her husband had passed away at that time, but she had told us that, and I guess she had moved to Massachusetts to be closer to her children.
I think she's in California. I know her son Neil was in the same, went through high school with my older son.
Well, you can send my regards, and if you use my maiden name, Hoffman, she know exactly who you're talking about.
We have another congregant who went through Shanghai, Sally Moisey.
Sally?
No.
But she wasn't. Sally Moisey?
No, Sally Moisey.
No, Sally was in Indiana, born in Indiana.
Yes.
I apologize. I thought for sure she went through Shanghai.
Oh, no. I had two friends in graduate school. One was in the dorm with me at Harvard, and the other was in MIT. And they met at Hillel. And they were from Shanghai. But I can't remember names.
Who's
May I
that?
ask who's speaking?
Mendel, Marty Siegel, Mendel Siegel.
Okay, thanks.
Well, thank you, everybody, for the lively conversation and for the memories. I just, what a blessing to be able to honor the memories of people in our congregation and your parents and grandparents, Jean, and your uncle, and to really see the way that sometimes, I guess, as a young person, it's sometimes the history just feels like history, and it's beautiful to have that opportunity to bring it alive with pictures and first person stories and memories. And as Jewish people, a lot has been written about the way in which Jews sort of respond to the world with memory as opposed to with history. And I think this was a really beautiful example of that. So thank you to everybody, and thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you, Jean. Thank you,
It's my
Rabbi.
pleasure. And Debbie, if you'd like to talk some more, please just shoot me an email and come and visit. There's a ton of stuff here. I have my own private museum here.
Wow.
And Rabbi, if I do a thing for school children as well, I have another slideshow where I talk about what happened and, it's what is, since you talk about memory and family, my family was very religious. My both grandfathers supported synagogues, and the family had started to assimilate. And it's kind of amazing that my whole family, myself, my brother, my children, my brother's children, went the opposite direction. We were all, practicing and in all levels, Reform, Orthodox, but it became, Dad had, he grew up in this assimilated environment, and yet he brought us up to realize, who we were, and it went in the other direction in terms of where our family was, because they no longer kept kosher. So if you would, and again, I would love to travel to Schenectady if you'd like. I speak to school children, and as I said, I start with where the family was and how the family changed and how the family has come back. So it's another journey. I thought the Jewish Book Council encouraged me to focus on the Shanghai experience. They said, everybody knows what happened in, Vienna and in Germany. Everybody knows that story. So that's why tonight's focus was mostly on China. And I don't think a lot of people know about the three communities. There are the Sephardim, the Russians, and the Jews from Central Europe. So that's why I chose to go that way. But there's a lot more there.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, everyone.
All right, we'll be in touch.
Okay.
Everybody.
Okay.
Good night.
Night.
Erev Tov.